Okay, picture this. Imagine a world where poetry completely tosses out simple, predictable romance and instead, it gives you this intense intellectual whiplash. Welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving into what's got to be one of the absolute most original, thought-provoking eras in the whole history of English literature, the Metaphysical Age. We're talking 1600 to 1660. It was a time when writers basically demanded that you think exactly as deeply as you feel, and they did it by blending romance, religion, science, and philosophy into a single, breathtaking verse.
I actually want you to genuinely ponder this for a second. What is reality? Like, what is the soul? Does God exist? What happens to us after death? Now, these aren't just your standard late-night dorm room musings, right? These were the profound philosophical questions that literally defined the intellectual landscape of the 17th century. Writers back then were just entirely obsessed with exploring the absolute deepest mysteries of human existence.
But then, they hit you with a massive bait and switch. Ask yourself, what is true love? Suddenly, we're pivoting hard from deep cosmic philosophy straight into romance. And honestly, this brilliantly captures the absolute magic of the metaphysical age. You see, these poets didn't think logic and love had to be kept in separate boxes. They combined the two, constantly challenging their readers to use their minds to actually understand their hearts. So, here's our roadmap for today's explainer. First, a world of change. Second, defining the metaphysical. Third, the power of wit. Fourth, hallmarks of the style. And finally, number 5, the metaphysical masters. Let's jump right into Section 1, A World of Change, England in the 17th century. So the 17th century kicks off under the rule of King James I in 1603, and he's followed by King Charles I in 1625. But listen, this wasn't just some simple, peaceful transfer of power. Not at all. This was an era just boiling over with immense political and religious uncertainty. You had Anglicans, Puritans, and Catholics all clashing, which, as you can imagine, created massive societal anxiety across the entire kingdom. Honestly, everything people thought they knew was suddenly up for debate.
And it wasn't just politics and religion causing all this chaos. The universe itself was rapidly expanding. Early scientific instruments and massive new discoveries were actively shattering those old, comfortable worldviews. You had astronomers looking up and totally challenging ancient beliefs about the heavens. Explorers were literally sailing off the edges of maps to expand the known world. And philosophers, well, they were pushing for relentless critical thinking. So English writers were suddenly thrust into this really complex world full of unanswered questions, and their coping mechanism was to create equally complex literature.
Moving on to Section 2, Defining the Metaphysical, Looking Beyond the Physical World.
The word itself actually comes from Greek roots, quite literally meaning beyond the physical world. When later literary critics looked back at the poetry from this specific period, they slapped this label on it because they noticed a pretty obvious pattern. These writers were totally obsessed with exploring concepts that go way beyond just mere physical existence. They weren't just writing about a pretty flower, They were writing about the soul, God, death, time, and eternity.
Now, what's genuinely fascinating here is this unprecedented fusion. Look at this balance. On one side, we've got raw, imaginative human emotion and deep faith. But on the other side, strict, reasoned, logical argument and intense intellectual debate. The absolute defining feature of the metaphysical poets was how they just smashed these two opposing sides together. They basically proved that you could feel deeply while simultaneously thinking incredibly critically.
Let's head into Section 3, The Power of Wit, the Age of Intellectual Surprise.
So, unlike earlier poets who relied heavily on ordinary, kind of flowery romantic comparisons, the ones saying someone's eyes are like stars or their lips are like roses, the metaphysical writers, they wanted to startle you. To do that, they relied on metaphysical wit, which meant creating these totally unexpected, intellectually stimulating images. It truly was the age of intellectual surprise.
The really crucial point here is how this wit actually played out in practice. Take John Donne, for example. Instead of using some simple, overdone romantic cliché, he compares two deeply connected lovers to the two legs of a mathematical drawing compass. Now think about the logic here for a second. One leg remains fixed right in the center, perfectly grounded, while the other leg roams out in a circle. Yet they remain perfectly connected, constantly leaning toward one another, working perfectly together to create that complete circle. It's so unusual, right? It forces you to pause and think. But once you finally get it, it's just incredibly profound. All right, Section 4, Hallmarks of the Style, Deconstructing a Metaphysical Poem.
So, let's open up the Metaphysical Toolkit. We've already talked about wit and philosophy, but their true distinctiveness really comes from dramatic openings and everyday language. These poets absolutely loved dropping the reader directly into the middle of a heated, dramatic conversation. And the best part? They didn't use overly decorative, artificial words. They used direct, conversational, everyday language to deliver these massive cosmic ideas. It made the poetry feel so immediate and so urgent.
Let's explicitly define a major term from that toolkit, the conceit. Basically, a conceit is an extended and really surprising comparison between two very different things. Remember John Donne's drawing compass we just looked at? That is the ultimate textbook example of a metaphysical conceit. It takes a rigid mathematical tool and somehow uses it to perfectly explain intimate human connection. And then, of course, we have the paradox. These are statements that seem entirely impossible on the surface, but actually reveal much deeper truths underneath. These poets just love to play with paradoxes. For instance, famously mocking death itself, claiming that death can in fact die. I mean, it sounds literally impossible, but within the framework of their religious and philosophical logic, it reveals a deeply profound belief in eternity. Finally, Section 5, the Metaphysical Masters, the architects of the movement.
The sheer versatility of this entire movement is just incredible. You've got John Donne right at the top, widely regarded as the absolute father of it all. Then there's George Herbert, who channeled this exact style into these deeply spiritual, devotional poems. Andrew Marvell, well, he used it to combine love, politics, and nature all at the same time. Henry Vaughan took things in a highly mystical direction, and Richard Crashaw poured all this raw, emotional devotion straight into his verses. This movement was so flexible it could cover everything from the halls of government to the deepest mysticism of the human soul.
Now, it's worth noting that at first, a lot of readers from that era thought this poetry was just plain strange, maybe even too difficult. But look at its legacy today. It continues to inspire both the heart and the intellect. These poems are still being studied in universities all across the globe right now because they remind us of something crucial. Literature isn't just about simple emotion. It's about big, challenging ideas. Great poetry engages the human mind every bit as much as it moves the human spirit. We've explored the era, the style, and the big ideas, but I really want to leave you with this one final thought. How did one man's secret marriage and completely radical life end up creating the greatest metaphysical poetry ever written? This journey into the world of wit, intellect, and imagination, it's really only just begun. So join me in our next explainer as we answer that exact question and dive headfirst into the fascinating, utterly chaotic life of the father of it all, John Donne. See you then.
All right, let's dive right into this. You know, we often think of 17th century poets as these dusty historical figures just sitting quietly in dimly lit rooms, totally detached from the real world. But today, we're looking at a guy who was a passionate rebel, a literal adventurer, a disgraced politician, and ultimately a reluctant priest. We're talking about John Donne, the absolute, undeniable father of metaphysical poetry. This guy lived multiple, extreme, chaotic lives all packed into one, and trust me, his story is anything but boring.
So, to really understand him, we kind of have to start by asking what exactly happens when you mix mathematics and hard science with passionate romance. Because before Donne, love poetry was, well, it was all about predictable, safe comparisons, right? Roses, sunsets, stars. But Donne, he completely disrupted the literature of his era. He looked at two lovers and literally compared them to the rigid legs of a drafting compass used in geometry. I mean, it was wild, it was weird, and it absolutely forced readers to think in entirely new ways.
And his life's ultimate paradox is perfectly captured in this famously punchy phrase, John Donne, and done, undone. He actually wrote this right after making a decision that completely devastated his life. It really just showcases his razor-sharp wit, even staring down the barrel of absolute, self-inflicted ruin. So, how did a man so incredibly brilliant end up completely undone?
Section 1. The Rebel Scholar, Early Life and Education.
Okay, so he was moving at warp speed from the very beginning. Born in London in 1572, right in the middle of the Elizabethan era, he came from a wealthy Roman Catholic family. Now, this is a huge detail because Catholics faced severe restrictions in Protestant England at the time. His father died when he was just 4 years old, but man, his immense intellect simply couldn't be hidden. He entered the University of Oxford at the shocking age of 11, but he wasn't just some quiet bookworm. By the 1590s, he was sailing off on military expeditions against Spain, traveling all across Europe, throwing himself right into the dangers of war, and just soaking up all these different cultures and political conflicts.
And that adventurous spirit built an absolutely incredible intellectual foundation.
I mean, check out the subjects he mastered: Latin, Greek, French, Spanish, theology, philosophy, history, law. His intellect was just staggering. And yet, despite studying at both Oxford and Cambridge, he never actually received a university degree. Why? Well, because he flat out refused to swear an oath recognizing the Protestant English monarch as the head of the church. It was this massive act of rebellion that cost him his official credentials. But, it certainly didn't slow his mind down.
In fact, that brilliance landed him a highly prestigious role when he got back to England. He became the secretary to Sir Thomas Egerton, who was one of the most powerful government officials in the entire kingdom. He was respected, he was highly ambitious, and he was sitting squarely on the path to an incredibly successful political career. He basically had it all figured out, and his future was glowing.
Section 2. A Secret Marriage, Love versus Career.
So, the year is 1601, and John Donne makes a fateful, incredibly dangerous decision. He falls deeply in love with Anne More. The problem here? She is the young niece of his powerful boss's wife. Knowing they would never, ever get approval for this, Donne secretly marries her without her father's permission. And let me tell you, the fallout was immediate and catastrophic, triggering this rapid domino effect. Step 1. The secret marriage is discovered, and Anne's father is absolutely furious. Step 2. Donne is literally thrown into prison. Step 3. Even though he is eventually released, his prestigious political career is completely and permanently destroyed. And Step 4. They are plunged into extreme poverty. Over the following years, John and Anne would have 12 children together, constantly battling severe financial hardship. He went from a rising political star to a disgraced, impoverished outcast almost overnight.
But here's the crazy part. Despite that deep poverty, their love inspired his greatest poetry. It was exactly during this grueling period of financial ruin and isolation that he wrote his most passionately profound, intellectually playful love poems. He had nothing left but his staggering intellect and his deep love for Anne, and he just poured all of it straight onto the page.
Section 3. Tragedy and Transformation, a Shift in Poetry. Then, in 1617, the unthinkable happens. Anne dies shortly after giving birth to their 12th child. For a man who had sacrificed his entire standing in the world, his career, his wealth, all just to be with her, this loss completely shattered Donne's world. The love of his life, his absolute muse, was gone.
And you can really see this stark contrast between his early and later periods. That early period of his poetry is defined by love, passion, wit, and romance. But after 1617, the later period is entirely consumed by themes of faith, death, salvation, and eternity. He didn't lose his intellectual sharpness, but instead of using it to write clever love poems, he turned that massive brain toward these really deep, existential reflections on mortality, suffering, and the human soul.
Section 4. The Reluctant Priest, Entering the Church. Now, for many years, Donne had actively resisted entering the church, but King James I recognized Donne's unparalleled genius and essentially forced his hand. The king firmly believed a talent like Donne's needed to serve the Church of England. So, recognizing he had very few other paths forward, Donne finally accepted ordination and became an Anglican priest.
And he didn't just become some quiet, small-town priest either. He was actually appointed Dean of St. Paul's Cathedral in London, which was one of the most respected and high-profile religious positions in all of England. The man who had once been a disgraced, impoverished outcast was now preaching to massive, packed crowds. Politicians, scholars, members of the royal court, they all flocked to hear him. His sermons were intellectually dazzling and incredibly moving, basically utilizing the exact same brilliant originality that made his poetry so unforgettable.
Section 5. Metaphysical Legacy, Global Influence.
So what does this all mean for his legacy? Well, metaphysical poetry is basically defined as poetry combining profound emotion with philosophy, science, and unexpected logical comparisons. Donne flat out rejected that conventional, lazy, romantic imagery. Instead, he used the complex languages of astronomy, law, and mathematics to explain matters of the soul and human connection. For readers in the 1600s, this was absolutely mind-blowing. He demanded that you think deeply while feeling deeply.
John Donne's legacy is truly undeniable. He's rightfully remembered today as the father of metaphysical poetry and the absolute master of conceits. Those complex, extended metaphors that really stretch the imagination. Whether he was writing playful love poetry in his youth, profound religious poetry in his later years, or delivering brilliant sermons,
He was a true literary innovator. And though he faced critics over the centuries who found his style a bit too difficult or strange, 20th century scholars eventually recognized his absolute genius. Today, his enduring global influence is felt in poetry classrooms and literary analysis all over the world.
So, I want to leave you with this provocative thought. If a 17th century poet could disrupt the entirety of literature by combining cold science and logic with passionate emotion, how can we challenge the boundaries of our own thinking today? Like, what conventional rules are we blindly following right now that need to be broken? Donne's extraordinary life, from scholar to adventurer, from lover to priest, gave him experiences few writers could ever match. In our next explainer, we're going to dive directly into his actual poetic masterpieces to see exactly how he pulled this magic off on the page. You definitely won't want to miss it.
Welcome to today's explainer. I'm so glad you're here, because today we are diving into the brilliant, kinda enigmatic mind of John Donne. If you've ever felt like classic poetry is, a bit too conventional or maybe lacks a certain intellectual bite, well, you're absolutely gonna love this. Donne was a poet who literally transformed English literature. Unlike traditional poets of his day who pretty much stuck to predictable rhymes about roses and sunsets, Donne did something completely new. He united cold, hard logic with deep, passionate emotion. He really believed that literature should challenge both the heart and the mind at the exact same time.
But before we get too deep into the philosophy, I want you to consider something. How can a tiny blood-sucking flea possibly become a symbol of love and romance? I mean, it is arguably the worst Valentine's Day pitch in history, right? Yet, this totally bizarre comparison is exactly what made John Donne a literary genius. He had this extraordinary ability to take the most unromantic, everyday objects and use them to construct airtight, logical arguments about human relationships.
Okay, let's dive into this, because understanding the metaphysical conceit is absolutely crucial. It's the key to understanding Donne's entire worldview. Now, a conceit is basically just an extended metaphor. But a metaphysical conceit? That's a whole different beast. It's a clever, super surprising comparison that builds a logical argument from a completely ordinary object to explain a deeply complex idea. It's not meant to be taken literally, at all. Instead, it invites us, the readers, to appreciate wit, imagination, and a lot of intellectual playfulness. Donne wasn't just expressing feelings, he was actually using logic to map out the human soul.
Section 1. Youthful Wit and Mature Love.
And this brilliantly illustrates how his mind worked early on. To really see this in action, we're going to trace the evolution of Donne's soul chronologically, starting with the highly playful poetry of his youth. Look no further than his most famous early poem, quite literally titled The Flea. Instead of praising a woman's beauty like everyone else was doing, he points out a tiny insect and lays out a logical trap. It goes like this. Step 1, the flea bites me. Step 2, the flea bites you. Step 3, because our blood is already physically united inside this bug, well, we're technically already united, so why resist? It's playful, it's funny, and it's a completely logical proof used for physical persuasion. He's literally making love into a game of wits.
But, Donne didn't stay that youthful provocateur forever. As he grew up, his perspective evolved profoundly. In his poem, The Good Morrow, we get a very different view of love. It's no longer just a game to be won with a clever argument. Instead, he celebrates a new world of mature emotional and spiritual companionship. The speaker in the poem suggests that before he and his partner found true love, their lives were incomplete. It was almost like they were just sleepwalking through a dream. But together, their relationship creates its own harmonious universe, one that's richer than any worldly treasure. It's this beautiful Renaissance belief that human relationships can actually reveal profound universal truths.
So, let me ask you this. Have you ever struggled to explain a massive, overwhelming feeling to someone else? Donne solved this exact problem through his evolving poetry. On one hand, you have The Flea, representing that early, witty attraction where logic is just a tool for physical persuasion. But on the other hand, The Good Morrow shows genuine emotional equality and spiritual unity. He took all that brilliant intellect he used for humor in his youth, and he repurposed it. He used it to articulate the profound, lasting fulfillment of mature love.
Section 2. Enduring Connection.
Now, what's really interesting here is how this plays out during a crucial moment in his life. We're looking at his most celebrated poem, a valediction, Forbidding Mourning, which he actually wrote right before a temporary physical separation from his beloved wife. He wanted to reassure her that physical distance couldn't break their bond. So how does he do it? Well, definitely not with tears or dramatic declarations. Instead, he compares them to a mathematical tool, the legs of a drawing compass. The fixed center represents the faithful partners staying at home. The moving leg is the traveling partner, and the shape they create together, that perfect circle, represents their genuine constant love.
It's just such a remarkable scientific image. Think about it. Even when that moving leg travels far away across the paper, the fixed center leans toward it, anchoring it. They completely depend upon one another. This compass imagery logically reassures us that genuine love remains connected, no matter the physical distance. It literally takes the cold, hard science of geometry and injects it with incredible romantic warmth. I mean, this right here, this is the absolute peak of metaphysical poetry.
Section 3. Confronting Mortality and Faith.
So the crucial point is that life isn't just about love and romance. As Donne entered his later years, his tone really shifted. He turned his powerful intellect away from earthly relationships and pointed it directly at heavy existential themes. We're talking death, sin, and salvation. The question was, how would Donne choose to handle the ultimate fear, human mortality? Well, in his famous poem, Death Be Not Proud, he does something incredibly bold. He talks to death as if it were a person standing right in front of him. And rather than cowering in fear, he challenges it. He declares death is neither powerful nor permanent. Instead, it is merely a temporary passage leading to eternal life. Drawing on his deep Christian beliefs, Donne strips death of all its scary power. He argues that death itself will eventually disappear. It's a tremendous intellectual victory that literally transforms fear into pure hope.
This whole intellectual and spiritual reckoning culminated in his later works, known as the Holy Sonnets. Now, these are definitely not lighthearted poems. They explore the soul's raw relationship with God, confronting human weakness and the desperate need for divine mercy. But what makes them so unique is that Donne doesn't just abandon his intellect because he's writing about faith. He asks incredibly difficult, sometimes really uncomfortable spiritual questions. He unites emotional honesty with rigorous philosophical reasoning. It really is the ultimate fusion of the human mind reaching out to the divine.
Section 4. Faith and Legacy. Let's move to Donne and see how this builds his entire legacy. Donne's unique ability to make poetry intellectually challenging while remaining deeply emotionally moving is what cemented his place in literature. He didn't just write pretty words. He completely rewired how a poem could function. And we can see this journey beautifully summarized across his entire lifetime. In his early years, we have the playful, logical, youthful wit of the flea. Then, moving into his middle years, he transitions to that mature, spiritual love and enduring connection found in the good morrow and a valediction. Finally, in his later years, he boldly confronts mortality and God in Death Be Not Proud and the Holy Sonnets. His poetry perfectly mirrored his life's evolution. He used the exact same intellectual toolkit, the conceit, the logic, the wit, to navigate every single stage of the human experience.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought to ponder. John Donne lived over 400 years ago, yet his method feels incredibly modern. In our highly scientific, data-driven world today, how can we use our own logic and intellect to express the unexplainable depths of our complex emotions? Donne proved that the mind and the heart are not enemies. They are partners. So try taking a page out of his book. Maybe the next time you need to explain how you feel, you'll look around the room, find a totally ordinary object, and build your very own metaphysical conceit. Thanks so much for exploring the genius of John Donne with me. Keep asking questions and keep learning.
So, if you've ever found yourself just looking for a moment of peace, or maybe seeking some deeper meaning in the everyday chaos of life, well, you're in exactly the right place. Today, we're exploring the life and work of a guy who took the absolute simplest, most ordinary aspects of the world and somehow elevated them into something truly transcendent. Let's set a quiet, contemplative tone as we unravel the story of George Herbert, the poet of faith.
I want you to just imagine this for a second. What if poetry could literally become a prayer? What if every ordinary object around you, a simple pulley mechanism, a stained glass church window, or even a tight, restrictive collar around your neck, what if they could reveal profound, life-altering spiritual truths? That's exactly the premise we're exploring today. We're looking into a mind that saw the divine not just way up in the heavens, but right in front of him in the mundane objects of daily life.
Because George Herbert did something genuinely extraordinary. As a prominent metaphysical poet, he transformed everyday experiences into what is arguably the finest devotional literature we have in the English language. And the coolest part? He didn't write about distant, unreachable concepts. No, he prioritized simplicity, absolute humility, and a deeply personal relationship with God. He made the spiritual completely accessible to all of us.
Section 1. A Life of Promise and Purpose. Okay, let's dive into this, because to really understand his incredible poetry, we have to look at the fascinating and honestly pretty surprising trajectory of his life. See, Herbert wasn't born into quiet obscurity. Born in 1593, he actually came from an intellectually rich, wealthy, and highly influential family down in Wales. He went on to become an absolutely exceptional student at Cambridge, mastering classical languages, philosophy, theology, the whole shebang. His brilliance even landed him the super prestigious gig of public orator at Cambridge in the 1610s. But then, there's a huge shift. By 1630, he's working as a priest in the tiny village of Bemerton, and just 3 years later in 1633, he publishes his absolute masterpiece and tragically passes away at the incredibly young age of 39. So how on earth did he get from being this powerful Cambridge orator to a quiet village priest?
Well, that brings us to this massive, dramatic crossroads in his life. In his youth, Herbert had these huge ambitions for success in the royal court. I mean, he was destined for fame, wealth, a brilliant political career for sure. But after the death of King James I, there was this massive shift in political leadership, and those grand ambitions kind of just faded. He made this remarkable pivot. Actually, scratch that. It was a total transformation. He completely abandoned the pursuit of fame and power to devote his life to the Church of England. He actively chose a life of service, becoming a humble village priest where he taught, counseled, and really just befriended his local community.
Section 2. The Temple, a masterpiece of devotion. It was out of this profound choice, living in the quiet rural village of Bemerton, that his greatest artistic masterpiece was actually born. Published shortly before his death in 1633, this monumental collection features over 160 devotional poems. And the title itself, The Temple, is just brilliantly layered. It symbolizes both the physical structure of a church building, where people gather to worship, but also the inner human soul, that deeply personal place where God dwells inside an individual.
And what makes the temple so enduring, and honestly so revolutionary for its time, is that it perfectly balances joy with doubt and prayer with sin and repentance. Herbert doesn't just hand you this flawless, untroubled picture of faith. No way. He honestly and vulnerably captures the everyday struggles, the really frustrating questions, and the ultimate hopes of ordinary believers. That sincerity is exactly what gives his poetry its timeless, emotional punch.
Section 3. Translating the Divine. To really appreciate Herbert, we have to break down exactly how he constructed his most famous works. The guy had a genius way of taking a super complex spiritual idea and basically mapping it onto something you could hold in your hand. Take a look at his poem called The Pulley. He uses this mechanical, everyday object to brilliantly explain a deep spiritual longing. In the poem, God blesses humanity with every possible gift, strength, beauty, wisdom. But he intentionally withholds one crucial thing, complete rest. Why? So that lacking perfect satisfaction, our sheer exhaustion and weariness will eventually toss us back to God's breast. It is just a stunning mechanical metaphor for human restlessness.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how relatable this next poem feels, even today. The Collar is a highly dramatic poem entirely about human frustration. The speaker in it is actively rebelling, just fighting against this tight collar of religious discipline and duty. You can literally feel the anger and the intense desire to break free in his lines. But then, right at the very end, that rebellion suddenly yields to God's incredibly gentle call, and the speaker responds with complete humility. It is a masterful depiction of an all-out spiritual tantrum calming down into peace.
And then, oh man, we have Easter Wings. This is arguably one of his most famous works because it's a visual poem. Herbert actually structured the printed text so that it physically resembles a pair of wings on the page. As the poem describes humanity's fall into sin, the lines physically shorten. They become narrow and thin. But then, as it speaks of spiritual rebirth through divine grace, the lines expand right back out again. The very appearance of the poem physically reinforces its meaning. It's brilliant.
Section 4. The Metaphysical Literary Style.
George Herbert definitely shared a lot of characteristics with his 17th century metaphysical peers, but his voice was completely distinct. While his mother was actually a patron of literature and close friends with another huge metaphysical poet, John Donne, look at the difference in their approach. And this brilliantly illustrates the contrast. Donne's poetry is known for loud, highly dramatic arguments and really complex intellectual wit. Herbert, on the other hand, went in the exact opposite direction. He favored quiet, personal meditation and purposely used simple, accessible language. He didn't want to argue, he just wanted to reflect.
His style is this perfect blend of deep religious faith, everyday language, and what we call metaphysical conceits, which are basically striking, unusual comparisons. He had this unique ability to turn totally ordinary household objects, like a window, a flower, a rope, or a church door, into these incredibly powerful, resonant symbols of divine grace. He had a knack for revealing the extraordinary meaning hidden right inside the ordinary.
Section 5, An Enduring Spiritual Legacy. As we touched on earlier, George Herbert's life was tragically brief. He passed away when he was just 39 years old. Yet the impact he left behind is such a profound reminder that true, lasting greatness is so often found in the most humble and quiet of places. His influence absolutely didn't stop in the 17th century. His work directly inspired subsequent generations of massive literary figures, from Henry Vaughan and Richard Crashaw to Gerard Manley Hopkins and even T.S. Eliot. Today, centuries later, university students and poetry lovers alike are still studying the temple. We still admire his absolute sincerity, his unmatched artistic creativity, and of course, his pioneering visual poetry.
So I want to leave you with this one provocative thought to mull over. Can an ordinary experience become a timeless spiritual reflection? Well, George Herbert proved that it absolutely can. He showed us that poetry can be a literal act of worship, and that there is profound, staggering beauty to be found in the mundane, if we just look closely enough. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. If you enjoyed unpacking the metaphysical age with us today, you definitely won't want to miss our next explainer, where we're going to dive into the brilliant political, philosophical, and love poetry of Andrew Marvell. Until then, keep looking for the extraordinary in the ordinary.
Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into the mind of a true genius of English literature, Andrew Marvell. We're looking at a writer who pulled off something incredibly rare. He uniquely blended romance, deep philosophy, bare-knuckle politics, and the serenity of nature into these absolute, timeless masterpieces. Most importantly, we're going to explore the massive, undeniable influence he had on the entire landscape of English poetry. So let's just jump right in and meet the man known as the last great metaphysical poet.
Think about this for a second. What if time was your absolute greatest enemy? It's a pretty universal anxiety, isn't it? That creeping feeling that the clock is just always ticking, that our days are numbered, and we're constantly rushing against some invisible deadline. I mean, we definitely feel it today with our crazy schedules, but Marvell captured this exact haunting feeling perfectly all the way back in the 17th century. He took this very human fear of time and used it to drive some of his absolute best work.
But then, on the flip side, imagine this. What if a simple, quiet garden became your ultimate symbol of paradise? Imagine finding the perfect refuge from the chaos of human conflict, unchecked ambition, and that relentless march of time, simply by stepping outside into nature. Well, Marvell did exactly that. He explored how silence and the natural world could actually be the ultimate antidote to the anxieties of everyday life.
To map out his profound impact on English poetry, here's our roadmap for this explainer. First, we'll meet the metaphysical master himself. Second, we'll explore time, love, and mortality, followed by finding peace in nature. After that, we'll look at his politics and poetic style, and finally, his lasting literary influence.
All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, Meet the Metaphysical Master. When you actually look at the sheer trajectory of his life, it's pretty astonishing. Born back in 1621 in Yorkshire, Marvell was literally a certified prodigy. He entered Trinity College, Cambridge at just 12 years old. Can you imagine? That early, intense exposure to classical Greek and Roman literature deeply, deeply shaped his elegant style. But here's the thing. He wasn't just some academic locked away in an ivory tower. He actually spent nearly 2 decades serving as a member of Parliament for Hull, and he did this smack in the middle of the English Civil War, Oliver Cromwell's rule, and the Restoration. This incredible mix of high-minded Renaissance humanism and gritty, practical political experience gave his work a grounded realism that completely set him apart from his peers.
Moving right along to Section 2, Time, Love, and Mortality.
So, you've probably heard the phrase carpe diem, right? Seize the day. It's all about urging people to enjoy life and love before it's too late. Well, Marvell took this classic Latin tradition and completely revolutionized it for English poetry in his masterpiece, To His Coy Mistress. He didn't just write a simple romantic plea. No, he challenged his readers to stare mortality right in the face. He forces us to reflect on how precious every single moment truly is, elevating what could have been standard romantic poetry into this profound philosophical statement that would echo through English literature for centuries.
He actually structures to his coy mistress, almost like a mathematical proof, or like a lawyer presenting a case. The logic is just relentless. First, he says, if time were unlimited, he'd happily spend centuries just admiring his beloved. But human life is incredibly short. Time moves way too quickly. And death? Well, that's an absolute certainty for all of us. So, the undeniable conclusion, we have to enjoy love right now. He uses this sharp, intellectual logic to frame these incredibly deep emotional and romantic ideas, which is just a textbook example of his metaphysical wit at play.
That philosophical depth also completely shaped his view of the world around him. Which brings us to Section 3, Finding Peace in Nature.
While typical romantic poetry from his era focused obsessively on human relationships, Marvell totally pivoted. He argued that true happiness and genuine spiritual peace are actually found in quiet reflection, completely removed from human ambition and conflict. In his poem, The Garden, he revolutionized how poetry treated the natural world. He elevated solitude into this highly valuable, almost sacred state of being.
For Marvell, nature wasn't just pretty scenery. It functioned as a symbol of absolute harmony. It's a world of innocence that offers real spiritual peace. And remember, Marvell lived through the bloody, chaotic English Civil War. So for him, trees and flowing water were a deliberate, almost desperate escape from the violent, turbulent 17th century world he lived in. He drew heavily on classical and Renaissance ideas to argue that silence and contemplation are just as vital to the human experience as any kind of political action.
That search for harmony was absolutely born out of his very real public life, leading us to Section 4, Politics and Poetic Style.
The really crucial thing to grasp here is that Marvell wasn't just a love-struck romantic or an isolated nature poet. He was a serious, working statesman, and he brought an unbelievable toolkit to his writing. We're talking metaphysical wit, deep classical learning, rich imagery, highly elegant language, relentless logical argument, sharp humor, and profound political insight. Because he impartially observed the Civil War, Cromwell, and the returning king, he could use all these tools to explore massive, complex themes, like national identity, justice, and liberty. His versatile style meant he could be incredibly elegant and piercingly intelligent all at the exact same time.
And finally, Section 5, A Lasting Literary Influence. Let's see how all these disparate elements form his ultimate legacy.
People often lump all the metaphysical poets together into one bucket, but consider the contrast here. You have John Donne, who is famous for this twisting, intense emotional and romantic intensity. Then you have George Herbert, who was strictly focused on deep devotional religious themes. But Marvell, he achieved this remarkable, unparalleled balance. He brought together intellect, classical beauty, a completely revolutionary view of nature, and gritty political realism. He didn't just lean on one single crutch, he mastered the whole shebang.
To really sum up his legacy, it becomes pretty obvious why he holds the title of the last great metaphysical poet. He permanently changed how English poetry deals with time and love. As a groundbreaking nature poet, his ability to bridge classical structure with natural wonder actually laid the direct groundwork for the English Romantic movement that would pop up a century later. The main reason his works are still fiercely studied in universities today is exactly because of this unique ability to unite breathtaking artistic beauty with razor-sharp reason.
Which leaves us with the ultimate, lingering question. How should we use our limited time? Marvell used his to craft poetry that literally continues to challenge and comfort us centuries later. He asks us to look right at the ticking clock, to find our own quiet garden, and to live our lives with both intellect and passion. I really hope this explainer has given you a fresh appreciation for Andrew Marvell's incredible influence on English poetry, and I invite you to keep this question in the back of your mind as you go about your day. Thanks so much for joining me on this journey, and keep exploring.